Welcome back to this next session in the AFRAS Summit. For the next hour or so, we're going to be putting a spotlight on the science and looking at the action imperative. We felt it was really important as part of looking back over the last 20 years as part of AFRAS's anniversary, but also then looking forward to ground the discussion in the trends that we're seeing in terms of the climate science, but also what the possibilities for the future are, what trajectory we'll follow if we take the actions we are now, but also how we can change that trajectory to have a sustainable future. I'm going to be speaking to two leading scientists to help inform this discussion. Firstly, Emily Shuckburgh, and then I'll be speaking to Tim Lenton. So to get us going, Emily is a world-leading climate scientist and science communicator and currently director of Cambridge Zero, the University of Cambridge's ambitious climate change initiative. She leads the UK national research funding body's Centre for Doctoral Training on the Application of AI to the Study of Environmental Risks. So brings a huge amount of insight also in terms of technology and the use of AI and how we can leverage that for good. Professor Shuckburgh also has worked for more than a decade at the British Antarctic Survey, so has seen firsthand a lot of the impacts of a changing climate on the world we live in. So Emily, it's fantastic to have you back for the AFRAS Summit and look forward to hearing the insights that you can share.
Oh, it's a pleasure to join you.
I'd love to get us started by really just setting out the science. Something that most people are familiar with, but I think it's really important to revisit the trends that we've seen and some of the latest data and insight and what that might mean. So starting by looking back over the past 2 decades, what are the key trends that you've seen unfold in relation to climate change?
Well, to be honest, the world was really in a different place 20 years ago. So if we look at some of the key indicators of climate change, in terms of carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere, 20 years ago, they were something like 375 parts per million. Whereas today, 20 years later, that's jumped up by about 50 parts per million, so that we're now encroaching on 425 parts per million. And since carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere are what drive climate change, then that has had a really dramatic effect on our climate. In terms of global average temperatures, roll back 20 years ago, and we hadn't yet breached 1 degree Celsius of warming compared to pre-industrial times. If we look at last year was exceptionally warm. 2023 was exceptionally warm and was coming close to that 1.5 degrees Celsius limit that we're really, really keen not to breach. So we really have seen, in terms of those kind of key indicators, a significant change. And that is playing out in terms of extreme weather events that we're now seeing in a way we weren't 20 years ago. We're now seeing playing out around the world, month by month, if not week by week, in terms of extreme rainfall or extreme heat, extreme wildfires, extreme weather events that are having a dramatic impact on people's lives, livelihoods, and business operations around the world.
So if we look at some of those trends and the implications, if you look ahead now, what are some of the data that you're seeing in the here and now that give you concern? And you touched on that 1.5 degree limit that was set out in the Paris Agreement and then the subsequent UN conferences since then. I think a lot of people feel that it's going to be virtually impossible to stay within that 1.5 degrees. So what does that mean in terms of the trajectory that we're on at present?
Yeah, so the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change tries to summarize what's a really complicated picture in a set of what they term reasons for concern. So that's trying to bring together the evidence base around key aspects of, I guess, the world system and how that might affect people and business organizations, but also the natural world as well. And so if we look at those different reasons for concern under different possible future scenarios and where we are today. So one of the most worrying reasons for concern is the impact on unique ecosystems. So coral reefs, which are a really important ecosystem in their own right, but also have significant implications in terms of all the commercial interests that are dependent on those coral reefs, from fishing to tourism, and many others as well. Those are already under severe risk at our current temperatures of between 1 and 1.5 degrees of warming. If we look at where all the pledges that have been put forward by nations in terms of limiting future emissions, they put us on a trajectory for around about, it's estimated, about 1.8 degrees of warming. And at that point, where we're already at high risk in terms of those ecosystems, that really stretches those into very high risk in terms of those ecosystems. But if we look not just at the pledges, but actually at the actual policies and actions that have been put in place by countries, then that takes us more towards 2.7 or maybe even higher degrees of warming. And that puts us at even greater risk in terms of those ecosystems. Also puts us at greater risk in terms of the sorts of extreme weather events that we've been seeing playing out around the world. As you increase those temperatures, whether to 1.8 or whether to 2.7 degrees, you get that much more impacts. But perhaps the most concerning aspect is the risk of passing tipping points in the climate system. So the sorts of things that we have concern about there are the risk of the vast ice sheets covering Greenland or West Antarctica disintegrating and resulting in very, very significant sea level rise, or the risk of significant changes to the overturning circulation in the ocean, or the risk of significant changes to the Amazon rainforest, switching between a rainforest and a more savanna-like ecosystem, or the risk of the vast stores of frozen methane that exist in the Arctic being released into the atmosphere as the Arctic starts to melt. So any of those aspects are tipping points that could be passed, and as we get into a more warming world, the risk of passing those tipping points is that much greater.
So can you just help everyone to understand what the implications of those trends are for people, for communities, and for the economy?
Yes. Well, I mean, in some senses, we've started in the last couple of years, I think, to start to get a few hints of what a future under a warmer world would look like, as we've started to see, really unfortunate impacts on communities around the world from extreme weather events in particular. And where I think we've only started to really understand the implications of that is the knock-on impacts of that. So, and the knock-on impacts that can be very, very dispersed. Extreme weather events that result in crop failures in certain parts of the world, then having an effect of raising food prices in many other regions, or extreme weather events that cause significant flooding in one part of the world, causing disruption to global supply chains. We've seen record low water levels in the Panama Canal, which in recent months, which has also had a significant disruption on global supply chains. So I think one of the aspects that has not been as well recognized that will have a dramatic impact on both people's lives and also on business operations globally is those knock-on impacts from our globally connected system. And so how we start to see those playing out, I think, is going to be something that's going to have a dramatic impact on all our lives over the coming decades.
I'm just thinking of the kind of timelines over which some of those impacts might unfold. Can you give a sense of what those timelines might look like and what it might mean for current generations, but also our children, our grandchildren, which takes us out For some, that might be, 100 years or more. So what does that mean in terms of the lives of generations to come?
Well, first of all, I think it's actually just useful just to do what we've just done. Think back 20 years and how much change we've seen in 20 years. And therefore, that gives you a sense of how much more change we could see in the next 20 years. And actually, as climate change plays out, it tends to be non-linear. So actually, we would expect in many instances that much more change over the next 20 years than we saw over the past 20 years. So first of all, I think it's important to realize that the world doesn't stay static in a climate change scenario at all. It's also the case that already today, in some of the extreme heat that we're seeing already today, particularly elderly people are at severe risk of that extreme heat in the UK and around the world. Places around the world that we've now seen hitting 50 degrees or nearly 50 degrees Celsius, which is really difficult to survive, particularly for elderly people. So all of us are going to be the elderly people in 20 years' time, and therefore, ourselves impacted. For our children and grandchildren, they're going to be living through a world that's very, very different to the world that we've lived in. And that applies to the climate, and it also applies more widely to nature, because, of course, the natural world is subjected not just to climate change, but also to real challenges in terms of biodiversity loss and in other environmental threats. And so it really is the case that the future, unless we really dramatically change our activities today, is not going to be the future that we have had the benefit of enjoying.
Thinking of some of those, you touched on the scenarios. A lot of organisations have started to do scenario analysis, particularly triggered by things like the Task Force on Climate-related Financial Disclosures, and that's now starting to become embedded into reporting standards. Something that we're seeing quite a lot of organisations using is narrative scenarios, as opposed to ones that try and put quantitative analysis, because, as you highlight, it's very hard to really get to grips with the different scenarios and what that might mean in a complex, interconnected world. Can you say a little bit more about how organizations, and particularly thinking of the finance and accounting community we work with, can make sense of the different futures that we might see and the implications for the kind of actions that we need to take now?
Oh, well, I think that scenarios approach is really, really critical, actually. And I've seen increasingly in the academic context how important it is to really start to look and take whole systems approaches to the analysis of any of both the problem or solution side of climate change. And the only way that you can really start to properly understand all those interconnections, that some of which we were just discussing, in that whole systems framing, is to start to look at those narrative scenarios. And that's where you understand the interconnections that you might otherwise not have identified, being really, really critical, both in terms of understanding the risks of future climate change, but also critically understanding where the opportunities for solutions might be. Once you've undertaken that sort of whole systems analysis and identified those narrative scenarios, then that also naturally leads on to another element that I see as being absolutely essential, which is identification of radical partnerships. That's in part where some of the new opportunities are, once you've undertaken that analysis, understanding how through partnership you can help deliver those solutions. So that, I think, is an equally key component associated with it. And then all of that sits in a wider framework of needing to accelerate solutions and implementation of those solutions, and also to always understand that these solutions are going to be applying in some kind of local context, and it's very clear that an element of fairness being at the heart of any of those solutions is also essential to ensure that those solutions are effective and lasting.
I think that's a really good segue into a bit more of a discussion around some of those solutions. So I think when you do look at the science, the trajectories, and the nature of the global collective action, it can feel almost impossible to have agency. So a focus on the actions that individuals and organizations can take is really important, particularly where there are always going to be competing short-term priorities that people are grappling with and trying to overcome. So can you just share some of the insights from the work that you do on the actions that organizations should be focused on to have the greatest impact on the trends that you've been talking about?
Yes, so I think in some ways I've started to come to the conclusion that one of the most important things is actually just a slight paradigm shift in how any of that decision making is undertaken. So of course, cost benefit analysis has been absolutely central to so much of our decision making, whether that's at an organizational level or at a national level. And yet it's not quite fit for purpose for many of the sorts of decision making that's necessary in this very rapidly transitioning world. And instead, something that's more focused around a risk opportunity framing and understanding decision making in that risk opportunity framing, I think is really central importance. So that actually just that shift from cost benefit analysis to risk opportunity assessment, I think is really, really important. But then understanding its specific actions, obviously it completely depends on what your sphere of activities are as to what the priorities in terms of specific actions are. If we break it down into the sort of traditional different sectors, then in many developed countries, we've already seen quite a significant decarbonisation in the energy sector, particularly in terms of electricity generation. We're starting to see signs of that in the transport sector as increasing electrification of the transport sector, but many other sectors of the economy, agriculture or built environment, have seen rather little change to date in most developed countries. And then that translates through then in terms of specific business activities. If we look at the food system, which is a really significant percentage of global emissions, for example, draws across obviously significantly from agriculture, but also when you look at the food system as a whole in that whole systems approach, then transport and some of the other parts of the economy are also important in terms of their emissions as relevant to the food sector. But understanding where there are opportunities for really making emissions reductions across the piece associated with those is where the real challenge is now. And some are going to be easy to implement and some of them are going to be much more difficult to implement. But it is quite clear that every one of those different sectors of the economy needs to reach net zero globally over, well, the course of the next 20 years. And so really understanding a phased planning of how to achieve that. And I think the critical thing is how to achieve that in an orderly rather than in a disorderly way is where the real challenge is. It's quite clear that some of that is going to come through innovation and some of that is going to come through behavioural change and some of that is going to come through a combination of the two. And in the UK, the Committee on Climate Change assessed that about 40% or so is likely to come from innovation itself, around about just over 15% just from behavioural changes, and the rest of it coming from a combination of the two. So both how new technology is developed, but also how that technology is utilised. So understanding the mix of different opportunities across sectors and across the different dynamics of whether or not that's technology driven or whether or not that's due to changes in the way that we live our lives is also going to be critical.
Can you say a little bit more about then where you see, I think you said 40% in some of the innovation that we might need. Can you say a little bit more about some of the opportunities or the innovations that you're starting to see come forward that really excite you and give you hope?
Well, some of them I think we've seen already, right? And actually, in a story that's normally a story of doom and gloom associated with climate change, the innovation side of things is where it starts to get exciting. So we've seen over the last 20 years a radical shift in our energy mix, to the point at which it's quite clear that renewable energy technologies are the technology of choice in most parts of the world now, both in terms of their cost and also the new opportunities that they deliver in terms of being able to be implemented in that more distributed sense. Battery technology, similarly, we've seen just a really dramatic technological evolution over the last 20 years and consequently significant reduction in prices as well. Starting to see that happening in terms of electric vehicles, so you can start to see where, just looking back over those technologies and the pathway that they've been going on, exceeding in most cases every possible expectation in terms of future forecasts, where there's just a real opportunity. So the exciting part of this story is the exciting opportunity in terms of new innovations. If we look at those sectors that have yet to really shift, but where there are clearly significant opportunities, agricultural sector is a difficult one, and agricultural sector is one where it's probably going to be a combination of some technological improvements in terms of smarter agricultural processes can help drive down emissions. But we're doing a lot of work at the moment in Cambridge, looking at the optimal ways of managing particular types of land, and where agricultural processes can be adapted in order to reduce emissions. And it is complicated, but in that sort of radical partnership way that I was describing a moment ago, there really are opportunities for looking at how we can create benefit for climate, for nature, and for the people who live and work in those landscapes. In terms of some of the other technologies, obviously AI and digitalization, smart systems are a real opportunity for increasing efficiencies and decreasing emissions at the same time. And there are other technologies as well across the piece that are currently sitting in lab benches at the moment, but could be rapidly rolled out, whether that's technologies to reduce our emissions through different industrial processes, for example, or whether they're technologies to actively remove carbon dioxide or other greenhouse gases from the atmosphere. Equally importantly, of course, is not just the technology developments themselves, but also how we can look to take advantage of nature in a good way, and look to nature-based solutions to help reduce emissions. And that's another area where there's significant progress being made, both in terms of understanding how we use nature-based and develop nature-based solutions, but importantly, how we put in place the monitoring, reporting and verification associated with those, and links through then to financial instruments.
And so I think a few points to pick up on there in a bit more detail, but maybe a cross-cutting one first of how some of the solutions that you've just touched on, as you say, some already really have gone to scale. Others are maybe at that tipping point in terms of really becoming pervasive in terms of the types of actions that people are taking. Can you say a little bit more about the timescales involved, and whether there are some things that those listening can do to really help accelerate adoption?
Well, I think that the critical bit is accelerating innovation and adoption, the whole pipeline. And I do think it's one where I'll come back to the radical partnership again, because if we look at areas where that acceleration has happened well, it's happened well because of bringing a tighter connection between all the different participants in the development and rollout of that innovation, and in particular bringing together those on the technology development side of things with those on the policy development side of things, and those on the finance side of things, and those who are likely to be adopting and implementing those technologies. Bringing those different parties together enables you to put in place a really seamless process for really driving rapidly that technology, up the curve, so that you really get to the scale up quickly. So you've got the right market shaping policies in place, you've got the finance coming in at the right stage, you've got the market helping to be developed, because you've got you've got a good connection between the technology development and those that might be actually utilizing that technology. I think that that's the key, because if that's not really put in place carefully, then that's where you look at sectors and industries that have had an incredibly long development timescale, and that's where we need to be shrinking that development timescale really fast. I think it can be done, and there are examples where we've been working in Cambridge in the aviation sector, one that has a really, really long timescale for development ordinarily, looking at how we can compress down that development timescale at every point of the process, all the way from the very research side of things and looking at how we can accelerate the timescale on the research side, and then through to the implementation side of things as well. And I honestly think that the finance sector is a really, really central part of that, and can help really drive that flywheel to accelerate, because they sort of sit in a really critical point of that's at the intersection of those different communities.
Yeah, and I think your point on how do we accelerate the decision making process, the innovation processes at each stage is a really critical one. And certainly some work that we did a few years ago looking at the whether there were any things that we could learn from responses to the pandemic. I think that that's one of those examples of the accelerated timeline that we saw at a time of crisis, and how with climate, which is a crisis of a huge scale but unfolding that much more slowly, how do we make sure that we respond in that similar kind of crisis mode? In terms of nature, you've touched on that a few times, and of course the climate is having a huge impact on biodiversity and ecosystems, which underpin our very survival as well. There are other drivers of the collapse in ecosystems and the loss of nature. Can you say a little bit more about how organizations can really connect the dots between some of the thinking that they might already have done on climate and the relevance to then nature and nature-based solutions, and developing a better understanding of the risks and opportunities that might exist in responding not just to climate but also to nature?
Yeah, so I think, as a whole, we are just less developed in understanding what our impact on nature is, as in our direct impact on nature is, and also on understanding how we can best help, if you like. And in some sense, the climate story has been a little bit simpler, because carbon and greenhouse gases are so obviously the key driver of climate change. So we have both an easy way of measuring where we're at in terms of our greenhouse gas emissions, and what our direct impact on that is as an organization, or indeed as individuals. In terms of nature, it's just that much more complicated, because there are so many different dimensions in which one might be interested in preserving nature, and how do we assess that. The good news in some ways is that as we have over recent decades become ever better at monitoring and observing nature, whether that is from satellites from space, or whether it's on the ground in terms of plethora of new ways of measuring biodiversity through instrumentation such as bioacoustics or eDNA. These are new technologies that have enabled us to get a much better understanding of biodiversity and continuous monitoring. New technologies and the development of digital approaches, including AI, have really started to bring us to a place where it is possible to start to have a robust monitoring and reporting and verification kind of framework, and where there's a real opportunity now that feels as though it's very much at the forefront of research and therefore of also opportunity, is connecting the dots between that development of the research infrastructure and then the development of the operationalization of that in a business context. Obviously, things like the Task Force on Nature-related Financial Disclosures and the development of that has been a really significant driver for looking at how we can create that connection across the research side into the business world. And I think there's a huge opportunity, and I would really encourage people to start to think about how they can get involved in understanding how we really make this work, because it's so clear. And as Partha Dasgupta made a very clear point in his seminal report, it's so clear that we are so dependent on the natural world, and the natural world is so dependent on us, and getting that symbiosis happening effectively is going to be essential to creating a sustainable future.
And as an aside, if anyone hasn't seen the work that Partha has done, Professor Dasgupta, he spoke at the launch of that as part of the A4S Summit a couple of years ago. So do look at the recordings of that if you did want an overview of some of that work. In terms of you also touched there on technology and the potential of AI. Now that's another area that you work in. So can you say a little bit more about where some of the trends are there and how organizations can be, if they're thinking anyway about the rollout of generative AI and technologies in their organization, how can they make sure that they're doing that in a way that also has a positive impact in terms of response to climate, nature, and other sustainability issues?
No, absolutely. So we're doing a lot of research, both at how we can use AI to help on better assessing the problem side on both the climate and the nature aspects, as well as how we can use AI in terms of helping generate solutions. The really central thing, though, is that any of that work has to be done in a context where the ethical and sustainability considerations are front and center, because as we have started to really discover, I think there are significant ethical considerations associated with using AI approaches. One of the aspects that we've been really trying to help promote is looking at human in the loop type approaches to try and mitigate some of the biases that might otherwise exist in some of the generative AI approaches. And equally importantly is the sustainability element. Done badly, those AI models can be incredibly energy intensive and have a significant environmental footprint themselves. And so really being careful, this is a technology that can be significantly used for good, but has to be really carefully implemented in order to ensure that it doesn't actually create significant harm.
We're nearly out of time, so two final questions. The first one is coming back to the trends that you were touching on. Even if we take action at the speed and scale that you were touching on in terms of the current pledges, the current commitments, we are still going to experience significant global heating, which means that action around resilience is going to be increasingly critical. Can you say a little bit about how organizations can be thinking about being better prepared for the change that we're already going to see, whatever we do?
No, absolutely. And you know, it's quite clear that particularly in developed countries, that resilience planning has been woefully under-resourced. I think it's a different story in much of the developing world where you know, actually that, you know, they've been most exposed to the impacts of climate change already, sadly. And so actually some of that resilience planning in countries like Bangladesh is much more advanced. But both for businesses and for nations, exactly as you say, we're already experiencing really quite significant impacts in terms of extreme heat and the impacts that that has, particularly in urban environments, or flooding, and the downstream impacts associated with that, wildfires in certain parts of the world. And so understanding the risks today and the likely risks that will increase in any scenario over the next 20, 30 years, understanding and planning and putting in place risk mitigation strategies associated with that is really essential. But it's really essential that that's not done at the expense of reducing emissions, because the more that you can do in terms of emissions reductions, the less that you have to do on the really challenging building resilience to those climate impacts. So the two go hand in hand, but they really do both need to be considered.
And coming back to the point you made around tipping points, you know, some of the changes, if we do cause those tipping points to be breached, there is no action really that is possible to mitigate against some of the things that the consequences that might arise.
Oh no, absolutely. No, they're globally catastrophic tipping points that would, I mean, if we're talking about the collapse of the ice sheets in the polar regions, that you're talking about the eventually leading to many meters of sea level rise, and there's no level of defense that you could put in place to protect against that.
Yeah. So just a final thought from you. This is A4S's 20th anniversary. So looking ahead in 20 years' time, what key takeaway would you want to leave the audience with, so that if we look back in 20 years, we won't have regrets about things that we didn't do now?
Yes, well, I think that the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, really threw down the gauntlet on that last year in its synthesis report, where it concluded that there's a rapidly closing window of opportunity to secure a livable and sustainable future for all. So in some sense, that's our challenge, and that's what we're going to be judged against. You know, we have, all of us collectively within our powers, the opportunity to try to hold that window open, and do more than that. One of the key words in that phrase was window of opportunity, because there are opportunities, huge opportunities out of this. And so if we can all in 20 years time look back and say, we recognized the opportunities, we seized them, and we managed to create a more sustainable world as a consequence, then we can look back and feel that we've done ourselves proud, and the world proud, and our children and grandchildren proud. But it is a rapidly closing window, and if we don't all take concerted action, then we won't be able to achieve that.
Fantastic. Well, I think we're going to have to leave it there, but an important thought to be leaving us with. So thank you very much, Emily. Some really useful insights and thoughts in terms of the future.
Thank you.
Our next speaker will be touching on some of those themes that Emily raised, and particularly diving into that question of tipping points. Professor Tim Lenton is the founding director of Global Systems Institute at the University of Exeter and chair in climate change and earth system science. He has done research in these areas for over 25 years, particularly focused on how to model the biosphere and the climate, and some of the associated tipping points that we are already starting to see. His work contributed to the setting of the 1.5 degree climate limit and the associated net zero targets and nationally determined contributions. So the commitments that governments have made in terms of reducing greenhouse gas emissions. I'm really looking forward to hearing from Tim and talking through and understanding some of those negative tipping points, what they mean, but also the positive. So Tim, a huge welcome. Looking forward to hearing from you.
Thanks for having me.
And really love to hear more about the work that you've done. You've done a huge amount of work on tipping points, both positive and negative. So can you start us by talking through what a tipping point is and why it's so important when it comes to looking at the trajectories that we have around climate?
Yeah, so a tipping point's where a small change makes a big difference to a system. I often invite people to lean back on their chair if they're feeling brave, because we all know that there's a sort of tipping balance point where a little nudge one way or the other is going to determine your fate, whether you end up back upright or sprawled on your back on the floor. And upright and sprawled on your back on the floor are two different, we could say, stable states of a system. Pretty simple system in that case, you and the chair. I'm concerned, and we're all concerned with complex systems like the climate and the life support system we live within, and also the complex economic system that we're actors within. But yeah, all complex systems, under some particular conditions can have the potential to pass tipping points. And at a tipping point, what you have is self-propelling change within the system. That comes about because of a particular type of feedback, we call it, where a little change within the system creates a response from the system that feeds back to amplify the initial change. And quite a lot, it's a strong amplification. So you put 1 unit of change in the system and you get at least 1 unit more change back. Then you're in a self-propelling situation. And so yeah, I've been working for 20 odd years to warning people about the tipping points we could cross in the climate, or may already be crossing tragically. But at the same time, I'm passionate about the tipping points we need to find and trigger in society and in technology to basically try and avoid the worst of the tipping points in the climate.
Maybe if we start with the negative ones first, and then hopefully we can end on that positive of where some of the actions that we can take to create positive tipping points lie. But starting with some of those negative tipping points in the climate system that you touched on, can you just set out what some of those tipping points are? And you alluded to some already maybe being triggered. So what if you look at the current trajectory, what is that all looking like, and how might it evolve?
Yes, well, the short answer is it's not looking good at all. We're in an emergency situation in the sense. But let's talk about what the tipping points are. We've been drawing up maps of the world to show them, and I think our list is over 20 now. But if we can break that down into maybe 3 classes of systems. So you've got icy things like bits of, we call it the cryosphere, but we're talking about the major ice sheets on Greenland, West Antarctica, even the East Antarctic ice sheet could be at risk if we keep warming things up too much. And then we've got bits of the biosphere, so the living Earth, if you like. So some major biomes can be tipped into a less desirable state, like losing the Amazon rainforest or losing the tropical coral reefs. And the third group of systems I describe as circulation systems, things to do with the circulation of the atmosphere or the ocean, or the two of them coupled together. So that can be tipping points where major monsoons, like in West Africa or India, collapse or are severely disrupted, which would be a massive humanitarian crisis, or key parts of the circulation of the ocean, particularly in the Atlantic. If they're tipped, it basically changes everything. It changes the whole pattern of climate across the world. So yeah, where are we at with the tipping points? Well, we reviewed over 200 papers of burgeoning literature, and we kind of drew up a risk assessment of where we are. And we see that 4 are now 5 systems are at risk at the present level of global warming. So those are the Greenland and West Antarctic ice sheets, at risk of being tipped into an irreversible meltdown. And Greenland holds about 7 meters of sea level rise equivalent. West Antarctica another 3.5 meters. West Antarctica can collapse faster. It's a different ice sheet. It's stuck to the bedrock well below sea level. That creates different dynamics. But yes, together they pose well, the potential to redraw the coastlines of the world and to flood land that's home to over 1 billion people at present. Then on the list of the near-term ones, the thawing of the permafrost, so the frozen soils of the high Arctic, that contains a lot of carbon, and it comes out as a mixture of carbon dioxide and methane if you take it out of the deep freeze. And coming out of the deep freeze can become self-propelling, because basically you thaw food for microbes that then start eating the soil, in simple terms, and give off heat as they do so, which causes more thawing and so on. So that's a big issue, because it has the potential, there's enough carbon locked in this deep freeze in the Arctic to, if released, significantly add to global warming and all the damages that come from that. And then we have part of the circulation of the North Atlantic Ocean. It's called the subpolar gyre, that hardly anyone's ever heard of. Sort of a horizontal circulation that wraps around the bottom of Greenland and the coast of Newfoundland, and then connects back up on the north side of the Gulf Stream. But if we tip that, and it seems to be quite unstable at present, then that's going to have major implications for the climate of the UK and parts of Western Europe, and make it much more seasonal. Harsh snowy winters, and yet hotter heatwave summers. So yeah, those are some of the closest tipping points, and that will give you just a little sense of the risks that we run with them.
And if you look at the kind of timelines over which, if we do trigger some of those tipping points, how over what kind of timescale will that?
Yeah, that's a very important question, Jessica, because different systems have their own characteristic timescales. It's a bit like when you try to imagine life for the fly. We look like these lumbering, slow motion creatures from the perspective of the fly. But if we look out into the Earth system, some things are very fast, even by human timescales. So a monsoon could, in the worst case, collapse from 1 year to the next. Whereas an ice sheet, it takes an awful lot of energy, heat energy, to melt it, even if it's in an irreversible meltdown. So we're talking about centuries or even millennia, depending on how much we warm the system, to finally lose all of Greenland or West Antarctica. And in between those timescales, you have biomes like the Amazon. Well, we've seen severe drought events and fires that can kill off swathes of the forest in a season, but to see a large-scale dieback might be more like decadal timescales. That's still pretty fast. And that tipping point in the North Atlantic Ocean I was discussing, that unfortunately can go quickly. That can be a decadal timescale thing, and we know from our records of Earth's past and the last ice age that we saw quite extraordinary climate changes of a magnitude of 8 or 10 degrees centigrade of warming within a decade in parts of the North Atlantic region. I'm not saying that we're at quite that abrupt a risk of change, but it gives a clear indication of, yeah, some things could be both irreversible and rapid. Other things can be irreversible but slower, but still they're just chronic, accumulating chronic damage, if you like.
I think it reinforces just the point that you made around that we really are in a crisis situation, that this underpins our the habitability of the Earth, the kind of human impact it could have, and that some of these impacts, well, we're already starting to see, but could really tip into a different state in very much human timescales rather than the centuries or the millennial for some of the others. it can leave people feeling that there's no point in action. Are some of these consequences inevitable, or what I guess this comes to the work that you've done on positive tipping points. So can you say a little bit more about how reversible they are and what we should be focusing on in the face of the trends you've been talking about?
Absolutely. So even though we are finding it hard to rule out that we might have crossed the tipping point for a significant part of the West Antarctic ice sheet that would end up giving over 1 meter of sea level rise, and we can't rule out that the Greenland ice sheet is also in a kind of self-propelling melt situation. The great thing about the ice sheets, because they're the slowest systems, is that we might still be able to rescue the system with a heroic effort if we can peak global warming and then bring the temperature down. We'll come to what that takes in a minute. Luckily, we're not yet convinced that we've passed a tipping point for something fast that we're not going to be able to stop. But the worry, of course, the urgency is that those points are could be looming close. So then the simple message is we've got to do everything in our power to accelerate the stopping of all greenhouse gas emissions from human activities, a lot of which are tied 3/4, you might say, to fossil fuel burning, and another quarter to our diet and food systems and agriculture choices and the associated deforestation. It has to be said that we're not reducing greenhouse gas emissions collectively anywhere near fast enough. I mean, on a global level, they're roughly stable. It's hard to say, they're fluctuating. We can talk about something called decarbonizing the economy. So how many units of greenhouse gas or CO2 equivalent do you release for each dollar or pound or euro of GDP? That number's coming down, but it's coming down about, by my estimate, 7 times too slowly to have a good, reasonable chance of meeting the target Paris Agreement. Let's keep warming well below 2 degrees centigrade. So if we need to go 7 or thereabouts times faster, we absolutely need to convince ourselves that we could find and trigger positive tipping points where change becomes self-accelerating in the technologies and the behaviors that shut down those greenhouse gas emissions. And my source of what my friend Simon Sharp calls plausible grounds for hope is that we see that empirical evidence that at least it's in some countries and in some sectors, change has really become self-propelling and self-accelerating and made very striking reductions in greenhouse gas emissions from those countries and sectors. And that includes shutting down coal burning in the UK, centered on about 2015, from 40% of our power supply to pretty much zero today. It includes the very rapid transition within a decade of the market for cars in Norway, from petrol or diesel cars to be dominated by electric cars. And now globally, big news, the exponential growth of solar power in particular, and also wind power, is well underway, and they are now the cheapest form of new power generation worldwide, even when you factor in the cost of battery storage that you need with renewables when compared to a new coal power station. And in many parts of the world, new renewables with battery storage are cost competitive with shutting down an existing fossil fuel power station with useful life left in it. Well, that's great news, because we're on a self-propelling change for a sector, the power sector, that is currently a quarter of our greenhouse gas emissions. But let's talk about it, because there's what about the other 3/4?
So I think it'd be good. Well, be good to dig into some of those. But where with the examples that you shared there, are there some key characteristics or some combination of circumstances that enabled that sort of tipping point to occur?
Yeah, what's really struck me in writing a book about positive tipping points is they've often started with social activists. The reason that Norway is 10 years ahead of the world in electric vehicles, having already tipped the market, traces back to members of the Popland AHA and their friend and architecture professor Harold Rosvik back in the late 1980s, coming up with a series of demands to the Norwegian government to incentivize a transition to electric vehicles, which is an incredible story. Equally, why do we have really cheap wind turbines that are getting better and better? That's tied up. That starts the story with the oil crises hitting Denmark really hard, and a mixture of kind of the government being forced to respond and academics and activists really pushing for, okay, what about this great wind power potential we have here? And yeah, I could give other examples, but typically we're talking about there's got to be a coalition of actors that come together to really create systemic change. And it might be often the citizens or the social activists that start agitating and triggering things. But of course, things work really well when governance starts to come on board and change the use of public money and the framework of incentives to incentivize the new thing. The new things always start out expensive because they're one-offs to begin with, but they always have the potential to get a whole lot better and a whole lot cheaper. And then, of course, as you go along that path, there becomes a crucial role for business and private money and finance more generally to bring things to scale. And a nice example of the injection of private capital would be how have solar panels got so incredibly cheap? Well, it's a long story, but a pivotal sort of takeoff point is when German policymakers around the early 2000s create a feed-in tariff and a market for the sale of solar panels that's quite large. And some Australian and Chinese researchers are starting up startup companies in solar panels in China, and they begin to fill that market. And then US principally investors spot as the market's liberalizing in China that these companies, well, why don't we float them on the stock exchanges in the US? And that happens for a series of the key companies. And there's a massive injection of private capital that basically kicks off what we call the economies of scale of increasing production brings down the cost of producing the next solar panel. In fact, for 40 years, solar panels have done something amazing. Every time the total number or capacity doubles, the price comes down about 25%. And it's doubled many, many times.
Which I think just underlines that some of those, that as you say, that tipping point has been triggered particularly in the energy system area, and that is now on a trajectory. You touched earlier on the remaining 75%. So can you say a little bit more of whether there are examples in that 75% or what might be needed and why maybe we haven't seen the same shift happening?
So firstly, I should cheer everybody up with the fact that, yeah, we're seeing the tipping happening, not just for the 25% of power sector, but for the about 7% of greenhouse gas emissions from cars, in simple terms. And we're beginning to see the tipping point from the cheap batteries, the ever cheaper batteries from the car sector, mean we're electrifying 2- and 3-wheeler transport in the global south and goods transport. That's another, goods transport would be another, on the roads would be another 4 or so%. So if we start totaling that up, I think we're pushing 35–40%. Now, once you've got electricity as like the cheapest, becoming the cheapest energy source, you've got a big incentive to electrify everything you can. And everything you can includes, like, let's electrify home heating with heat pumps, which is also going on a kind of exponential growth curve, particularly in Europe at the moment, which is bringing the price down. Then you get to some activities you can't electrify easily because you're moving a large mass a long distance, like on a ship, or you need a lot of thrust, like in a long for a long distance, like in a long haul aircraft. Then there's the option to make what's called green hydrogen, or split water using renewable electricity. And then from green hydrogen, you make all sorts of fuels, green ammonia for ships, green ammonia actually for fertilizer as well, synthetic jet fuel eventually for those long haul flights if people still want to take them, etc. the point there would be there is the potential for a positive tipping point across, or multiple across, the green hydrogen economy, not least because the technology of splitting water with what's called an electrolyzer, we're already seeing incredible economies of scale. So if you build a bigger electrolyzer plant, the price comes down pretty spectacularly, actually, as well as the fact that the electricity you need to do it is all coming down in price all the time, the more we roll out the new renewables. So in simple terms, I find that most of the 3/4 of emissions that come from the energy system have credibly got the potential for a positive tipping point. There are just a few so-called hard to abate sectors where that's not at all obvious, and that would include making cement, which is a significant chunk of emissions. And it may be in those cases we have to be more creative, and we'll be thinking about substituting something else for clinker, a different kind of cement, or maybe we'll just make high-tech wooden buildings or whatever. But what about the quarter of emissions from basically dietary choices, which then drive deforestation? Because on average, people across the planet are eating more meat. Well, it could be there. We've got to think about a tipping point in dietary preferences, because in some of the richest nations, including the UK and the US, we are actually consuming less meat and animal products, about a 15% decline just in the last decade, which is quite striking. And we're not talking about everybody needing to become vegetarian or vegan, far from it. We're just talking about just even, you might say, a modest reduction in meat consumption in diets can, because basically raising livestock, especially beef cattle, is so spectacularly inefficient in the use of land and resources. Just modest changes in diet pay back massive dividends in terms of land use, stopping deforestation, as well as the methane emissions, a significant chunk of which come simply from beef, cattle, and cows. So we see a kind of mixed potential for, there can be a social movement to change diets. We see lots of evidence for that already, social influences, etc. If you don't, want to turn away from your beef burger, the good news is something that tastes just like a beef burger, but is actually a plant-based alternative protein burger, tastes pretty much as good with the same texture now. So there's a technology that can substitute for the thing you want to eat, and that's just going to get cheaper and better the more of it gets produced. So it's more, it's less far along, the transition for food and systems and diets, but the potential is there. And the important thing to also acknowledge is the resistance is there as well. So just as we have a massive fossil fuel lobby and a load of subsidies trying to keep the status quo in the energy sector, and frankly failing now, I think, over in the food system, I'm afraid it's worse. The lobbying and the amount of public money spent on supporting livestock farming is just spectacularly outstrips any efforts towards alternative proteins and diet change. So we've undoubtedly got work to do there, but that is the nature of a tipping point, that you have to work on kind of eroding the resilience of the dominant way of doing things, which I think of this as a sort of valley we need to make shallower and lower the hilltop, between separating the way we do things now, the status quo, and the new way of doing things that's sustainable and better for our health, better for animal welfare, better for the planet, in that case of changing diet and food systems.
So what kind of actions can individuals and organizations take that is going to speed up or enable some of these tipping points to occur?
So as individuals, we've all got some agency because we're consumers and we can choose what we consume. We're doing that several times a day in terms of what we eat. We're probably doing it less often in terms of buying a new car or a second-hand car or whatever, or white goods, or you name it. But even at those levels, we've got agency to back the change rather than the status quo. Equally, we could ask ourselves or our pension fund some difficult questions about where our pension fund is invested, because a lot of them, I'm afraid, are still being invested in maintaining the status quo, but some are showing progressiveness in shifting. Then we come to our institutional role, which is, you know, different for me as an academic to an accountant in a business or whatever. But the good news is this cuts across the whole of society, basically. So whatever your institutional role, we can find a way in which it's either going to be part of the problem, just maintaining the status quo, or part of the change, part of the solution. And how much agency we have in our institutional role, of course, varies for all of us. But it's certainly additional to what we have as individuals, and it's really particularly powerful when, as we team up from different kind of institutional roles in society, and we find a common ground of wanting to be part of the change together, and we work out how my changes can help reinforce your changes that help reinforce my changes, if you see what I mean.
Yeah, and I think if I think of the work that we do at A4S, quite a lot of it is actually on that, with that in mind, of how can we bring together the right set of people to enable everyone to step forward more quickly and try and create some of those positive changes. If you were to think of that sort of business, finance, accounting community, are there some actions that you think would be particularly relevant for them to be taking?
Yes, and the first thing I want to say is my outsider's observations of the community, which therefore may be inaccurate, is there's an awful lot of following each other going on, in a sort of, I don't know how to describe it, but it's its own kind of feedback loop. And in any sphere of human endeavor, there's norms, they're called. We call them social norms as academics, a sort of, yeah, the dominant way of doing things. And there's always usually some penalty for the people up front who challenge the dominant norms. But also, even if the new norms are clearly better, that provides some sort of barrier, this sort of punishment, or whatever you want to think of it as. Yet there can be huge amounts to be gained in shifting to the new norms. So we always have that delicate tension. Who's brave enough, basically, to lead? But the crucial thing is others are habitually following anyway. So what am I going to say more broadly to those sectors? First, it kind of baffles me that the finance sector talks about its norms and its rule structures as if they were written in like permanent ink, never to be changed. But the point is, somebody some body or bodies once wrote them, and they've probably been changing them all the time and fiddling with them, and they can definitely be changed again. We need to get out of the mindset that, you know, the rules are fixed. The rules are not fixed, and the rules might have to change to help us make the change we need, and that includes redefining things. What does it mean to have a fiduciary duty to the holders of a pension fund or whatever? Well, it means not bequeathing them a planet that's completely trashed when they come to draw their pension and is a mess. But yeah, many answers to I would make to many different, you know, businesses. But I suppose I'd say broadly, even if you only care about competitiveness, watch out as a business right now, because these forces of change I'm talking about that are becoming self-propelling, like this total change in our energy system. And if you're not switched on to that, and you're not getting on board with that and working how you can work with that, you're going to get left behind, and that's not going to be good in the general role. So even if I can't persuade you on a moral or ethical basis that hey, your kids are going to look at you and in a bad way if you don't do something here, or whatever else floats your ethical boat, I can convince you that, you know, there's a business risk here in not actually being part of the change, because some of the change is self-propelling, and the more of us who get behind it, the more businesses that get behind it, the faster it's going to spread. And the beauty of that is even if you don't want to buy in now, you're going to find yourself following eventually.
And just to join the dots in terms of the speed of some of the changes that you've been talking to, do you have a sense of how quickly positive changes could unfold and how that compares to those negative tipping points. I mean, do you feel that we can achieve the positive shift quickly enough to avoid some of those negative tipping points?
I do, Jessica, and I needed to convince myself of that by looking hard at the data. But I mean, I go back to some of the earlier examples. The car market in Norway tipped from petrol or diesel vehicles to battery electric ones in a decade. In the UK, we shut down 40% of our power from coal burning in less than a decade, and it's that 40 or more percent is coming from new renewables. The rise of renewables a little bit slower, so there's a little blip of gas substitution in the meantime, but now the renewables are displacing gas power as well. So it's a decade or type of time scale, and by 2030, we're potentially going to be seeing some really striking change and growth from the growth of renewable energy, from the electrification, first of mobility, but increasingly of other things like heating and towards heavy industry. So it's in my world at least a relatively fast time scale of change. That may be because, of course, as a climate person, you see this whole raft of timescales. But I think most businesses still want to be in business in more than a decade's time. So I think these changes are super relevant because they're at least that quick. And you've got to change, there's going to be all sorts of exciting challenges and changing business models, etc. As we go, it's possible to go to zero greenhouse gas emissions before 2050. It's up to us if we achieve that. And I think the take-home message might be we're never going to achieve it if we don't shift our expectation and believe that it is possible to achieve that. But by looking at the data and modeling this stuff out, I can see that it is possible. And it's now a question of let's shift our expectation. Once we believe it is possible, then maybe we can actually achieve it together. With all of the exciting challenges and change that will bring, and I know we're not conditioned to like change, but if we're in business, we might realize that the biggest business opportunities are in change, not in the status quo.
Fantastic. Now, I'm afraid we're out of time, but if there's one key takeaway that you wanted to leave people with, so that, if we look 20 years ahead, then we are looking back with continued hope and optimism and having realized some of those opportunities that you were touching on, what's that key takeaway?
Looking back from 20 years' time in a good way, it'll be that this was the moment where we connected the dots. We saw that this was our only credible way out of trouble, and a kind of social movement, if we can call it that, began across all kind of spheres of activity where we saw that together, and we just got on with embracing the change to make it self-propel, to make it go faster, because the penny dropped and we saw that there was no viable other path. If we carried on the way we're going now, it was going to end catastrophically badly, and there was no room for an incremental option that would still end in catastrophe. And that the penny dropped now, and we saw that we put the urgency together with agency, with action.
Fantastic. Well, I think that's a good note to be ending on. If I look back over the last 20 years, I think some of the tipping points and the changes that you've been talking about in terms of the accounting finance system, I think of our own founder, the King, as was Prince of Wales. I think he was probably one of those early leaders who wasn't afraid to stand up and voice things that at the time were not popular and were not the norm. And I think if I think of everyone we work with and those listening, I think we've really seen that shift in a sense of what is needed and what is possible. So I think you've given us a lot of inspiration in terms of carrying on, and I think that there's a lot of momentum to be riding into the future.
Great, amen to that.
Fantastic. Well, thank you, Tim.
Thanks, Jessica.
Thanks again, Tim. Really great to have those insights. So I think that's all we've got time for this session, but do come back for the next, where I'm going to be speaking to Catherine Hayhoe. Now, Catherine's another climate scientist, but she's really going to be picking up on some of those points that both Emily and Tim touched on in terms of action and social change, and how we can all use our own voice to drive change and to drive action and create the positive tipping points that Tim was talking about just then. So do join us back in about an hour.